Giselle said it to him exactly once, her voice as cold as polished steel. "Stay out of my life." Liam didn't argue. He picked up his toolbox, crossed the conference room, and walked out without another word while 8 board members watched in silence. His 6-year-old daughter was waiting in the parking garage below, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit the way only small children hold on to the things they cannot afford to lose. He had no time for people who looked through him, as though he weren't standing right there. But 3 weeks later, it was Giselle herself who stood at his apartment door at 11 o'clock at night, tears falling and her hands trembling at her sides. What could be so devastating that the most powerful woman in the room came crying to the man she had dismissed? The morning started the way most of Liam Ashford's mornings did, quietly, carefully, and with a precision that most people around him never noticed. He was 29 years old, and he had the particular kind of stillness that comes not from having nothing to carry, but from having learned exactly how to carry everything at once. By 7 o'clock, he was kneeling in the narrow hallway of their third-floor Brooklyn apartment, tying his daughter's shoelaces, while she stood above him, clutching Scout, the stuffed rabbit with the frayed left ear and the small plastic eye that had been red-glued twice, pressed flat against her chest like a small, soft shield. Arya was 6 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, wide and honest and completely unguarded, the kind of eyes that catch things other people miss. She looked down at her father and asked the same question she asked every morning, the same one she had asked 300 and some days in a row without fail. Was he going to be there to pick her up this afternoon? He told her yes. He always told her yes, and he had never once been wrong about it. The apartment was small but arranged with the quiet care of a person who paid close attention to things. A bookshelf ran the full length of one wall, and the books were organized not by title or author, but in a system that only made sense if you understood the particular way Liam's mind worked, which very few people did anymore. On the corner of his desk sat a spiral notebook filled edge to edge with symbols and equations in his own handwriting, the ink slightly smeared from the heel of his left hand. Arya called it the hard book. She had once asked what all the numbers meant, and he told her they were a puzzle he was trying to finish, and she accepted that the way children accept things that feel true simply and completely, without needing it to be anything more. He wore the dark blue uniform of the building maintenance staff at Weston Capital, the company name stitched in small yellow letters at the collar. He had been working there for 14 months. No one on the executive floors knew what he had done before, and he had not volunteered it, because it had not come up, and because it was not the point. 3 years earlier, Liam had been a vice president of risk analysis at a firm in Lower Manhattan, the kind of place where titles meant something and the coffee was served in glass mugs, and the work was genuinely difficult in ways that required him to be genuinely good. He had been good at it, exceptional, actually, and he had known it without needing anyone to confirm it. What he had not anticipated was the particular way life can reroute itself without warning or logic or any of the things that make difficult situations bearable. Claire had died on a Tuesday afternoon in November, on the expressway, in a car that was making a perfectly ordinary left turn. She had been on her way home from the office. Arya had been at home with the babysitter. Liam had been in a strategy meeting when his phone began to ring, and didn't stop. He submitted his resignation the following week, not because he could no longer do the work, but because he could no longer see the point in it, when there was a 3-year-old at home who needed someone in the apartment when she woke from bad dreams. Scout was the last thing Claire had bought for Arya, a few weeks before the accident. Arya had not once left the house without it since the morning of the funeral. He dropped Arya at school and watched her small figure disappear through the yellow doors, with Scout tucked into the side pocket of her backpack. The teachers had agreed she could keep it there within reach during class, because they were people who understood what they were looking at when they saw a child holding something that tightly. He took the bus to Weston Capital, rode the service elevator to the mechanical floor, and began the part of his day that most people in the building never thought about at all. He was good at this work too, though in a different way, precise and methodical, with an understanding of systems that went deeper than the training manuals required. His supervisor had once told him he thought too hard for a maintenance job. Liam had thanked him and gone back to the cooling unit he was calibrating. 22 floors above him, Giselle Weston was standing at the glass wall of her corner office, and looking out over a city that had no idea it was about to watch her either prove herself or collapse. She was 28 years old, and she had been the chief executive of Weston Capital for 2 years. Since the week, her father Harold suffered a stroke severe enough to remove him from daily decision-making, but not severe enough to stop him from watching her, from the guest chair in board meetings, with an expression she could not always read. The company was his life's work. He had handed it to her, not because there was no one else. There were 3 senior executives who had expected the chair to go to them and had not concealed their disappointment, but because he believed she was the right personne, and Harold Weston was a man whose instincts had rarely failed him. The board of directors did not share his certainty, and they watched her the way people watch a tightrope walker, politely, attentively, and with a readiness to respond appropriately when the balance shifted. The merger with Harland Group was supposed to be the thing that settled the question for good. $340 million, the largest transaction in Weston Capital's history, and the signing ceremony was scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning. 6 months of negotiations, 2 rounds of due diligence, and a final audit package that Xavier Monroe had delivered to the board 2 days earlier with his usual quiet efficiency. Xavier was the chief financial officer, 43 years old, and he had been with the company since before Giselle was in high school. Her father had trusted him completely, without reservation, the way you trust someone who has been in the room every time something difficult happened and has never once made it worse. Giselle had inherited that trust the way she had inherited the desk and the corner office and the 64-year history of the firm without questioning it, because there had never been a visible reason to. He arrived at her office every morning with answers to questions she hadn't finished asking. She found the reliability reassuring in the way you find a reliable anchor, reassuring, without stopping to inspect the chain. On the morning that would change everything, Liam was called to the 22nd floor to inspect the secondary server cooling unit inside the executive conference room, a refrigeration loop that ran parallel to the main trading floor system and connected directly to the transaction logging infrastructure on the floors below. It was a routine check, the kind that happened every 6 weeks and usually took less than an hour. The problem was that Aria's teacher had called at 7:45 to say she had come down with something. The school was short, 2 staff members, and Aria would need to be collected before noon if alternative arrangements couldn't be made. Liam called 3 people in the following 20 minutes. None of them answered. He called the school back and explained the situation honestly, and by 8:15, he had no solution and a work order with a hard deadline before the 10 o'clock board meeting required the room. He brought Aria with him. He told her twice on the way there in the specific quiet tone he used when something actually mattered that she was to sit in the chair in the hallway outside the conference room and not move, and not make noise, and not, under any circumstances, go inside. Aria lasted 11 minutes. She wasn't trying to cause trouble. She had simply never been this close to a room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the whole city, and the view pulled her in the way gravity pulls things that have not yet learned to resist it. She brought Scout and settled herself cross-legged on the carpet next to her father's toolbox and did not make a sound. She was doing her absolute best to be invisible. The board members arrived at 9:58, 12 of them, moving through the glass door with the focused purpose that large amounts of money tend to generate in the people responsible for it. Giselle came in last. She stopped when she saw the child on the floor. She looked at the child, then at the man in the blue uniform crouched beside the server cabinet, then at the board members who had all stopped behind her and were looking at the same thing. Liam stood. He introduced himself by name. He explained the situation without preamble: the teacher, the failed backup arrangements, the work order, the fact that Aria had not touched anything and would not, and his voice was level and clear, and he did not over-apologize or perform remorse. He simply told the truth about what had happened. Giselle listened to 3 sentences of it before she made her decision. "This is not a daycare," she said. Her voice was perfectly controlled, perfectly professional, and about 15 degrees colder than the room. "I need both of you to leave right now." Liam nodded. He began collecting his tools and returning them to the case with the same methodical care he brought to everything. Before he closed the lid, he looked up at her, not with anger, not with any particular expression at all, but with the straightforward tone of someone passing along information they believe the other person will need. "The cooling loop on the secondary server unit has a pressure leak," he said. "Small, but it's been building for about a week. If you don't address it before the end of the day, you may see disruption in the transaction logs during peak trading hours this afternoon." Giselle looked at him with the specific look she had developed for people who said things she did not have time for. "We have an IT department," she said. "That isn't your concern." One of the board members, a man in a charcoal suit who had been with the company for 11 years and believed this gave him certain informal permissions, made a sound that was technically a cough. It was not a cough. Arya looked up from the floor and looked at her father and asked, quietly enough that only he could fully hear her, whether those people didn't like him. He didn't answer. He set his hand briefly on the top of her head and guided her toward the door. Giselle said the 3 words as they reached the threshold: "Stay out of my life." Flat and final, and carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being the last word in any room. Liam stopped for 1 second. Then he walked out with his daughter beside him, her hand inside his, and he did not let his shoulders drop once. That evening, Liam made pasta because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesday was pasta, and Arya sat on the kitchen counter, the way she always did when he cooked, Scout propped against the flour canister, and they talked about her day the way they always did, in pieces, circling back, letting it move at its own pace. She asked him why Scout was named Scout. He had told her the story before, but she liked the repetition of things that felt true, so he told it again. Claire had named it. She had said that Arya was the kind of person who always found the things that were hidden from everyone else, and a scout looks ahead of where everyone else is looking, and it seemed right. Arya turned this over with the seriousness she brought to all important questions, and then asked whether Scout could actually find hidden things. Liam said it depended on who was doing the holding. After she fell asleep, he sat at his desk and opened the laptop and worked on the risk analysis model he had been building for 2 years. A platform constructed in the hours between Arya's bedtime and midnight, piece by careful piece, on a foundation he had laid without supervision or deadline or anyone waiting on the result except himself. But before he opened his own files, he sat for a moment, thinking about what he had seen 3 weeks earlier when he had first been called up to the 22nd floor. The session had been routine. The senior technician on shift had stepped away for 2 or 3 minutes, and the configuration display had been left open on the monitoring terminal. Liam hadn't meant to read it closely, but the timestamp seeded into the encryption layer caught his attention in the way that certain numbers catch the attention of certain people without any deliberate invitation. The date was one he could not see without recognition. The 14th of March, 2021, Arya's birthday. He would not have understood the significance of the encryption architecture itself if he hadn't spent 14 months of his graduate work at Columbia studying exactly this class of algorithm, a timestamp-seeded encryption system, narrow in application, documented in exactly one academic paper from 2019 that he happened to have co-authored. It was not a commercial design. It was not something you would find in an off-the-shelf system. It was the kind of architecture that appeared in academic literature, and then, very occasionally, in the work of someone who had read the right paper. He had not mentioned it to anyone. He had finished the cooling unit inspection he had actually been called to perform, done the work, written the service report, and gone home. It was not his building in any sense that mattered. He tried not to think about it again. 3 weeks passed. Weston Capital moved into the final audit phase before the merger signing, and Xavier Monroe delivered the supplementary financial package with the smooth confidence of a man who has performed this kind of operation many times without incident. It was a junior internal auditor, a 26-year-old named Casey, who had been with the firm for 7 months and had not yet learned to mistake small for insignificant, who found the anomaly. It was a 0.003% variance in the quarterly reconciliation, a single line that did not resolve cleanly against the surrounding entries. In absolute terms, it represented roughly $400,000 trivial against a $340 million transaction, the kind of figure that could be attributed to rounding methodology or system timing without anyone objecting. Casey did not attribute it to anything. She wrote a note and passed it to Diana. Diana took it to Giselle. Giselle asked the IT department to pull the relevant transaction logs. The IT department came back with news she had not prepared for. The logs covering the flagged period were encrypted using an architecture they had never encountered, and they could not break it with their available tools. They estimated 48 hours to resolve it using external support. Giselle checked the time. The merger signing was at 9 o'clock the following morning. 48 hours was 39 hours too many. She called 3 cybersecurity firms that evening. All 3 said the same thing, 72 hours at minimum, because the architecture wasn't one they recognized. Xavier arrived at her office at 9 o'clock, unhurried, carrying his phone and a glass of water, and the particular calmness of a person who has already decided how a conversation is going to go. He told her this was a routine anomaly, that these kinds of minor variances appeared in any large-scale audit, that the IT team would have the encryption resolved well within the margin, that she should not allow a rounding artifact to jeopardize a transaction of this magnitude. He spoke for exactly the right amount of time and said nothing that was technically incorrect, and when he finished, Giselle thanked him and he left. She sat in the silence of her office and stayed with a feeling she could not precisely name. Something about the speed of his reassurance, something about the way he had arrived, already knowing what she was worried about, and already carrying the answer. She pushed it aside. Xavier had been her father's anchor for 15 years. She did not have enough to lift an anchor without being certain of what was beneath it. By 10:30, it had not improved. A 4th cybersecurity firm confirmed what the others had said. The encryption methodology did not exist in any commercial database they maintained. They could work around it, but not in fewer than 3 days. Giselle stood at the window of her office and looked at the city below and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives late at night when there is no one left to redirect it, that she was at the edge of something she could not solve with the people she currently had. If she signed in the morning without clearing the anomaly, she was absorbing a risk she could not quantify into a transaction that could not absorb it. If she did not sign, 6 months of negotiations collapsed. The board would have the argument they had been building toward since the day she sat down in the chair, and Harlan Group would find a competitor who was not dealing with unexplained gaps in their transaction history. Diana knocked and came in without waiting, the kind of familiarity that had accumulated quietly over 2 years of long evenings, and sat down and said nothing for a moment. Then she said she had been trying to remember something. Then she remembered it. The technician, the conference room, 3 weeks ago. The cooling loop and the transaction logs and the exact words he had spoken before Giselle had told him to leave. Diana had been sitting in the corner of that room with a notepad, and she had written down what he said the same way she wrote down everything, without filtering for immediate relevance, because she had learned that relevance was a thing you often only recognized in retrospect. She opened the notebook and found the entry and read it back exactly. The cooling loop on the secondary server unit has a pressure leak. If it isn't addressed before the end of the day, you may see disruption in your transaction logs during peak trading hours. She read it twice. Giselle listened to it both times. Then she said, "Find me his personnel file." The file told her almost nothing that helped: name, age, address, department, 14 months of clean service records, no flags. Diana, reading over her shoulder, opened a browser and typed the full name into a search engine without being asked. The first result was an academic paper from 2020, published in a Journal of Computational Finance, the kind of publication that exactly 3 categories of people read: graduate students, their professors, and the narrow subset of finance professionals interested in the theoretical foundations of what they were actually using. The title of the paper contained a specific phrase that Giselle recognized from the technical description the IT team had sent her 3 hours earlier. She read the abstract. The second author listed was Liam R. Ashford, Columbia University. She read it again, more slowly. Her heart, which she had spent 2 years conditioning to remain steady under pressure, began to move faster than she intended. She looked at the clock, 10:47 in the evening. The signing was in 10 hours and 13 minutes. She looked at the address in the personnel file. She looked at Diana. Diana said nothing, which was its own kind of instruction. Giselle picked up her car keys from the desk drawer and put on her coat and walked to the elevator without a second pair of shoes or a bag or anything except the address on a folded piece of paper and a desperation she had been too proud to admit to herself 48 hours earlier. She drove herself, which she hadn't done alone at night in 2 years, and the familiarity of it hands on the wheel, the city moving past the windows without waiting for her opinion, was briefly grounding before the weight of where she was going settled back in fully. Liam's building was a narrow 4-story walk-up in a part of Brooklyn that had not yet been renovated into something that required a waiting list, and she climbed 3 flights of stairs in heels that were not designed for stairs and stood in front of apartment 314 and knocked. She was not wearing her work face. She was not wearing any constructed expression at all. She was simply a person who had exhausted every other option and had enough honesty left to arrive knowing exactly that. When the door opened, Liam looked at her with the same quality of stillness he had brought to the conference room, watchful, unhurried, and entirely unintimidated by her presence or her position, or the fact that she had sent him out of a room in front of 8 witnesses 3 weeks ago. He was wearing a plain gray shirt, and there was a notebook on the table behind him, and the apartment smelled of soap and something warm that was simply the specific atmosphere of a place where a child lives. He looked at her once, then looked past her into the hallway to confirm she was alone. She was. He looked back and waited. She said his name. Her voice broke slightly on the second word, not dramatically, not in a way she would have chosen if the choice had been available to her, just a small fracture in the professional surface that appears when a person has been holding too much for too long. "I need help," she said. He didn't fill the silence with reassurance. He didn't step back and hold the door open reflexively. He just looked at her and said, "What kind?" She told him. She kept it as short as she could, because she owed him at least the basic respect of not wasting his time. The encrypted transaction logs, the merger signing in under 11 hours, the 4 firms who couldn't break the architecture, the academic paper with his name on it, the encryption method she believed he would recognize. She watched him take it in. He was quiet long enough that she began constructing the gracious sentence she would say when he declined the one that would be measured and composed and would not show how much everything was riding on the next 30 seconds. Then he said, "You know I considered saying no." She said she knew. He said, "Then why aren't I?" She looked at him directly and said the only true thing she had left to say, "Because your daughter is asleep in that apartment. And I think you don't want her to grow up believing that doing the right thing stops mattering the moment it becomes inconvenient." He opened the door the rest of the way. He told her to come in and to be quiet because his daughter was sleeping. The apartment was everything the personnel file had not told her. She registered the notebook on the desk and the equations, filling it margin to margin. The bookshelves along the wall organized according to a logic she couldn't immediately parse. The small pair of sneakers lined up precisely next to a larger pair at the door. Scout was on the corner of the coffee table, slightly tilted to one side, the frayed ear turned outward. She looked at the rabbit for a moment before she looked away. She transferred the log files from her laptop to a drive and handed it to him without preamble. He sat at his desk and opened the files and went quiet in the way that people go quiet when they are doing something they are genuinely built for, not performing, not positioning, just working with a part of themselves they don't have to manage. Giselle sat in the other chair and watched. He recognized the architecture in under 2 minutes. She could see it in the quality of his attention, in a small shift of his posture, in the particular stillness of someone whose intuition has just been confirmed by evidence. He didn't announce it. He kept reading. After several minutes, he said, without looking up, "Timestamp, seeded encryption. The key is a date used as a seed. Whoever built this used a specific academic framework documented in a paper published in 2019. He paused. "I know the paper." Another pause. "I co-authored it." Giselle said nothing. He finally looked at her. "The seed date is what I need to break it. 3 weeks ago, when I was in your server room, I saw a configuration file on the monitoring terminal before your technician came back. The timestamp in that file was March 14th, 2021. He let the silence hold for a moment. "You asked me to leave before I could finish." She wanted to say something adequate to that, and found the language for it hadn't been invented yet, or at least she couldn't locate it at 11:30 at night, with 10 hours until the most consequential morning of her professional life. She looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about the conference room and the board members, and the 30 seconds she had spent deciding he wasn't worth hearing out. He could have filed an anonymous tip. He could have contacted the regulatory authority. He could have done nothing and simply let whatever was wrong in that system continue until it became someone else's emergency. He had done none of those things. He had gone home to his daughter, kept the observation to himself because it was not his building and not his business, and was now sitting at his desk at midnight, decrypting her files because she had shown up at his door with nothing to offer except the truth about how desperate the situation was. He rebuilt the decryption algorithm from memory, writing it cleanly and quickly in a language that moved efficiently under his hands, and the system began to process. The room was quiet while it ran. At some point, Giselle said, without quite deciding to, "Why did you leave finance?" He didn't look up from the screen. "Something more important came up," he said. She didn't ask the follow-up. After a moment, she asked about the rabbit's name. He told her the story, Claire, the naming, what a scout is supposed to do. She was quiet after that. The clock on the wall read 1:17 in the morning when the display populated. The files unlocked in sequence, one after another. And then the full transaction history was on the screen, 3 years of it, every entry, every timestamp, every account routing code. Liam read through the first 20 lines without speaking. Then he set down the small notepad he'd been using and said, "You should call your attorney right now." Giselle leaned forward and looked at the screen and understood, in the way that understanding arrives when it has been postponed for as long as possible, exactly what she was seeing. The figure that had been hiding inside the reconciliation anomaly was not $400,000. It was $47 million, moved across 31 months through a sequence of transfers that were individually small enough to vanish against the volume of legitimate activity, each one below the automated flagging threshold, each one timed to coincide with high-volume periods when oversight was thinnest. All of them routed through a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, every single one authorized by the same digital signature, Xavier Monroe. She sat with the number, and she sat with the name, and she sat with the particular quality of understanding that comes from realizing that something you believed was solid has been hollow the whole time. 3 years. Every board meeting, every strategy call. Every morning he had walked into her office with a calm answer to a difficult question. She didn't cry. She was past the part of the night when crying was available to her. She looked at the wall and thought about what the next few hours would require and began to prepare for them. They reached him in the lobby of Weston Capital at 5:42 in the morning as he was coming through the main entrance carrying a coffee and a leather portfolio and the particular composure of a man who believes he has managed every relevant variable. Giselle was there, and the company's lead attorney, and 2 federal agents who had driven down from the field office in response to a call placed at 2:15 a.m. with a complete evidentiary package transmitted alongside it. Xavier saw the group before he reached the elevator bank. He stopped. He looked at Giselle with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not panic, not guilt, but a rapid internal recalculation happening behind eyes that had spent 43 years perfecting the art of staying unreadable in difficult rooms. He tried the first option, which was a calm and measured denial. There were accounting methodologies. There were interpretive frameworks. There were explanations for the figures that the IT department's unfamiliarity with the system had prevented them from accessing. The attorney placed the printed log on the lobby table in front of him. 31 months, $47 million. 31 transfer authorizations, each bearing his digital signature, each routed to the same offshore account. There was no framework that addressed that. Xavier looked at Giselle for the last time before the agents moved. "I was keeping this company alive," he said. "You don't have enough experience yet to understand what that required." Giselle didn't respond. She nodded once, and Xavier Monroe was escorted through the lobby doors and into the pale early morning, and the space he left behind was very quiet. The attorney was already on his phone, moving into the next sequence. Diana had appeared from a side corridor. At some point she had a way of being where she was needed that Giselle had long since stopped questioning and stood nearby without speaking. The glass doors showed the street outside beginning to lighten, the specific gray-blue that a city wears in the 30 minutes before real dawn. Giselle stood in the lobby, and felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has just finished carrying something much heavier than they realized they were carrying, and she understood, for the first time in 2 years, exactly how much of the ground beneath her had not been solid. The person she had trusted most had been dismantling the foundation she thought she was standing on, and the person she had dismissed in 30 seconds in a conference room had seen the first crack in the wall 3 weeks before it broke open. At 9 o'clock that morning, instead of a signing ceremony, there was an emergency board session. Giselle walked in alone, without Xavier beside her for the first time in 2 years, and presented everything from the beginning: the variants, the encrypted logs, the encryption architecture, the $47 million, Xavier Monroe, the federal referral that was already in motion. And then, because she had decided somewhere between 2 in the morning and 5:42 that she was done building things on ground she hadn't personally inspected, she told them about the maintenance technician and what he had said 3 weeks earlier and what she had done instead of listening. She said it plainly, and she did not edit it or soften it. She said it in front of 12 board members and the 2 Harland Group representatives who had arrived, expecting a closing ceremony, and found themselves in something else entirely. The room was quiet for a moment. The lead Harland representative said they appreciated the transparency, and the merger was not withdrawn. The signing would move back 1 month to allow a comprehensive external forensic audit of the full transaction history. It was the best possible result for a situation that, an hour earlier, had appeared to have none. After the session ended and the room began to clear, one board member stopped her in the corridor, the same one who had made the sound that was not a cough 3 weeks ago, and asked who the technician was. She found him that afternoon near the north entrance of the building, working on an electrical panel in the access corridor, with his toolbox open at his feet and his full attention on the task in front of him. Aria was beside him on the floor with her backpack, doing something in a small notebook, homework probably, or one of the elaborate drawings she narrated to her father in the evenings. Scout was in her lap. Giselle crossed the lobby and stopped in front of them. There was no audience, no board, no attorneys, no one with an interest in how this went. Just the lobby and the corridor light and the 3 of them. She crouched down to Aria's level and looked at the little girl with the stuffed rabbit and said, "I owe you an apology. The last time I saw your dad, I wasn't kind to him, and that was wrong of me." Aria considered this for a moment, with the serious attention she gave to things that seemed important. Then she lifted Scout from her lap and held it out with both hands, an offering as deliberate and as genuine as anything Giselle had received across a conference table. "You can hold Scout if you want," Aria said. "It always helps when someone is sad." Giselle took the rabbit carefully. She held it, and something that had been locked behind her sternum since approximately 2 in the morning came undone very quietly, and she let it go. When she stood, she looked at Liam, who had watched all of it without speaking. She said, "I'd like to offer you the Director of Algorithmic Risk position. Name your own terms." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he shook his head, without any particular performance of reluctance or satisfaction. "Thank you," he said, "but no." She waited. "I'm building something of my own," he said. "I think I'm almost finished." She understood, more completely than she would have 24 hours before, that this was not pride, and it was not a negotiating position. It was simply a person who knew what they were doing, and had been doing it steadily for 2 years, without needing anyone to validate the direction. She handed Scout back to Aria, who received the rabbit with both hands and resettled it in her lap with the practiced care of someone returning a thing to its exact right place. Giselle said, "If you ever want a first client for whatever you're building, call me before you call anyone else." Liam looked at her. Something shifted in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was the architecture of one. "I'll think about it," he said. That evening, Liam made pasta because it was a Wednesday, and pasta didn't have opinions about which day it was. Aria sat on the kitchen counter and told him about the woman from the tall building who had held Scout for a little while and had cried a little bit, and then seemed like she felt better afterward. Liam stirred the sauce and said yes. He thought that was probably right. Aria swung her feet against the cabinet door and asked whether Scout had found something hidden today, the way Scout always found the things that were hidden. Liam turned from the stove and looked at his daughter at the wide, honest eyes and the serious small face, and the rabbit held loosely in the crook of her arm, and said yes. Scout had found something hidden today. Something that had been hidden for a long time. Arya was satisfied with this. She watched him finish the sauce, and told him she was hungry, and asked if they could watch the program about the deep-water fish after dinner, the ones that lived in the dark part of the ocean and made their own light because they had learned not to wait for it to arrive from somewhere else. He said yes. He said it the same way he said it every morning when she asked if he would be there to pick her up. Simply, fully, without qualification. After she fell asleep, he sat at the desk and opened the laptop, and the platform was there, the way it had been there every night for 2 years. The risk analysis model he had built in the hours after Arya's bedtime, piece by careful piece, on a foundation he had constructed himself with no deadline and no board, and no one waiting on the result, except the version of himself that knew what he was building toward. The logo in the upper corner of the interface was small and clean, Ashford Analytics. He worked for a while. He saved the file. He closed the screen and sat in the quiet of the apartment, and the quiet felt different tonight than it had the night before. Not better exactly, and not lighter. Just different, in the way that things feel different when a long-held weight has shifted slightly into a new position, and you realize you've been carrying it so long you'd forgotten what your hands felt like without it. The following morning, before Giselle had finished her first cup of coffee, an email arrived from an address she didn't have in her contacts. There was no subject line. There was a single sentence in the body. Scout has been returned to the right owner. Have a good morning. She read it. She read it again. She set the cup down on the desk. Outside the window, the city was already moving at full speed, the way it always was, by 8 o'clock, fast and loud and indifferent to the interior lives of the people inside it. And Giselle Weston sat at her desk in the quiet of her office and smiled before the workday started, which was something she had not done in longer than she could clearly place. Liam Ashford had never needed anyone to confirm who he was. He had known it on the morning he walked out of the conference room with his daughter's hand inside his and his shoulders level. He had known it during the 3 weeks he had said nothing about what he had seen, because it had not been his to say. He had known it in the hour after midnight, when he had opened a stranger's files and done the work simply because it needed doing, and he was the person who could do it. Some things are hidden very carefully in 31 months of carefully timed transfers, in an encryption architecture that only one paper had ever documented, in the assumption that the person in the blue uniform is there only to fix what you point him toward and has nothing else to offer. But as Scout had taught Arya, and Arya had taught him without meaning to, and he had taught Giselle, without quite realizing he was teaching her anything at all, the things that are most worth finding are never hidden forever. They are only waiting for someone who looks at the right moment, in the right direction, and doesn't stop before they finish the sentence.